Heyo people! I delayed covering the Brawler buffs due to some issues confirming details, and because I wanted to take the opportunity to cover a slightly more nuanced thing about AK skill effects that may affect many classes. So let's start with that. But first, shout out to Lind in the Discord for providing all the nitty-gritty details for the class adjustment as usual. The first note here on the Brawler adjustment is that killing targets no longer prevents you from getting your charge statuses, and as I said, this leads into a little game knowledge for all classes that I want to explain in detail today. You may not have noticed, but many classes have buff effects that do not work if the skill kills the target. Watch on my bow here, who has the Arrow of Light move speed mastery on. When I one-shot a target, I do not get my move speed buff, only the base skill buff. Then, versus Benkei here, when I don't one-shot him, I get both. Obviously, I don't have access to the code to see how the timing for everything works, but the move speed buff on Arrow of Light also does not trigger on chests even when I don't one-shot them. I take that to mean that some buff effects for yourself do not work if the target dies before the status effect of the skill is applied to the enemy. For example, one-shot or immune to debuffs. Here's another test with a third boss in Winged Duke's Domain. Can't debuff the boss, can't get my move speed buff. So, that being said, you can see how it sucks if on a Brawler, which requires you to stack 3 Sky and 3 Earth charges, then release them for buffs, you can't generate those running between bosses because you one-shot everything on the way. I swear the rest of these changes are not going to take that long to cover, each, but since the chance was here, I wanted to share that info with players who may not know. Anyway, it's a pretty big adjustment, but nothing visual, so there's no clear visual comparison I can do like I did for Guardian and Grenadier. The global cooldown has been reduced to 1 second for the skills Swift Strike, Lotus Strike, and Shadow Strike. That refers to the time after using the skill that you can't use another skill. Swift Strike also has a new effect, reducing the target's defense by 10%. The 30-minute buff skill has been overhauled as well. Before, it was only flat damage and flat crit, and then a 3% damage and crit if you're a Brawler main. The amount of flat damage and crit has been increased, flat speed has been added as well, and all three get an extra 5% on top. Then, if you're a Brawler main, you get an additional 10% damage and 10% crit. The left path skill, Frantic Lotus, can now be held 3 seconds longer for a max duration of 8 seconds. And, on the topic of left path, the level 1 to 30 and 30 to 60 crit damage buffs have been increased, but the level 60 is still just 30%, so it's not more crit damage overall in the end, but a nice boost for the newer to the class players. In the notes of the change, and the text in-game, the martial arts mastery effect is supposed to change from stacking damage versus all targets to stacking boss damage, but, and this is why this took so long, I can't trigger that. The only buff you can see from my boss damage is from my holy chest. This isn't just because my mastery is only 50, I had a friend with 60 plus mastery check and they also could not trigger the 5% they were supposed to get. Shout out to Xdel. I will go ahead and submit a ticket about this and keep you guys posted. And finally for left path, the Shadow Strike effect has been removed from the level 60 left path and has been replaced with Sparks and Flames, now increasing the target's received physical and flame skill damage by 10% and will also now give an additional 2 earth charges when used. If you're more of a right path kind of person, Whirlwind Kick will now apply damage every 0.2 seconds instead of 0.3. The skill lasts 3.5 seconds, so would apply damage 11 times on one use before, and now it should be able to hit 17 times. This is indeed, as Lynn's notes say, a 50% increase in damage potential if the target is kept in range for the full duration. The old Sparks and Flames buff from the right path is now gone. Instead, we have Swift Strike applying a Storm damage taken debuff and Shadow Strike applying a Dark damage taken debuff. Electrocution no longer gains crit rate and no longer triggers Thunderstorm, but is also in the Elemental damage debuff game with a Lightning damage taken increase for targets. The passive max HP buffs and damage taken reduction buffs have been increased, and unlike the left path, this includes at level 60, meaning overall more HP and less damage taken for all right path brawlers of any mastery level. Defensive Kick has lost its all element resistances stacks, and is now a reduced damage taken from all elements and physical skills buff, which stacks 2 times. It also has a special icon on your skill bar, so unlike the left path, you can clearly see that this one is working. You're probably thinking it kinda sucks that we don't get that stacking elemental damage that used to be on the left path anymore, but don't worry, we got it back somewhere else. And by somewhere else, I mean the Envoy path, which we're covering now. Secret Techniques used to be a simple 10% damage and 10% Qatar damage buff that triggered when you did a critical hit, but now not only does that stack twice, the elemental target damage stacks we lost on the weapon masteries have been added here. 3%, 10 stacks, total of 30%. Very nice. Ride the Winds used to be a 15% crit rate buff for your storm skills and a 10% chance to trigger 30% more damage for only Swift Strike, but that is a fairly niche node. It has been replaced with Full Force Unleashed. This is a 5% buff to Storm, Thunder, Fire, and Dark skill damage that stacks on attack, up to 4 times, plus a buff that increases your next Swift Strike, Shadow Strike, or Electrocution by 10%, stacking 3 times, meaning they have increased the skills affected by this node and haven't reduced the damage buff. Using any one of those 3 skills will clear the stacks though. And finally, the old Truthseeker node would have a 50% chance to remove a debuff and a 50% chance to increase all your stats by 10% and max crit damage by 20% when you dodge an attack. The new effect is a 100% chance to remove 5 debuffs from yourself when you take critical damage, once every 5 seconds, and, if that's not enough, the same 10% all stats and 20% crit damage cap will apply every time you take a critical hit as well, but now it stacks twice too. So, that's it. And that's what took me too long to get out. I am sorry for the delay. Again, I'll just tease we have a big event coming up next week, and it's just getting bigger by the day. I'm really excited to show you all. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you next time.